Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to cover the aftermath of the French and Indian War and the Peace of Paris and deal with all of the issues that were created in this ostensibly British victory in the French and Indian War. So, here are your objectives. Pretty straightforward. Pause, take them in, process / write them down, and let's tell our story. The Peace of Paris, signed in 1763, was a settlement at the end of the Seven Years' War. It did some stuff in Europe, but what's important for us is the massive territorial change that it created in the Americas, where the French basically gave up all of their North American colonies to the British. So you can see clearly British land before the French and Indian War, British land after the French and Indian War. And as we mentioned last time, of course, this is completely ignoring the Native American tribes that already were living on this land. So yeah, fun. The war was incredibly expensive for the British because, of course, their strategy of bringing the regular army across the Atlantic Ocean was very effective in sieging northern French cities, but incredibly expensive. And so the British national debt increased pretty substantially after the war. It had already been increasing over time with all of these sort of dynastic wars in Europe, but the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, significantly increased it. And so, of course, the British government needed to find some way to both mitigate the costs of the war and potentially pay down the debt to some extent. This is coupled with the fact that they've moved the regular army across the Atlantic Ocean, and now they have to figure out what the heck to do with them. And so they've got all these troops stationed up in the northern colonies, and they have to find a way to either pay for them to stay there or ship them back across the ocean. And the British government, quite frankly, didn't have the money to do any of these things. Plus, the Ohio River Valley was very, very much unsettled, as we remember from last class, with Pontiac, a Native American chief of the Ottawa tribe, putting together a multi-tribal coalition to run a very effective war, destroying British forts and basically teaching the British that, okay, you beat the French up in Canada, but beating us in the Ohio River Valley is a totally different animal. And even when the British regular army did march into the Ohio River Valley, they were soundly defeated. So, what are the British going to do about this whole Ohio River Valley thing? They came up with an answer called the Proclamation Line of 1763. The British government more or less drew a line right about down the Appalachian Mountains and then said that everything east of that line was good for American settlement and everything west of that line was reserved for Native Americans forever. This is, on the one hand, somewhat of a smart settlement because, of course, it gives Pontiac and the other native chiefs what they want. They now have access to the land that they previously believed was theirs. But if you remember, the entire war was started over Virginians like George Washington selling land in the Ohio River Valley. And so the British government telling them that, hey, that land that you'd bought in the Ohio River Valley and were planning to sell for a profit, well, I know we won a war to give you that land, but now we're not going to let you settle it. So, enforcement was somewhat of a problem because, again, it's incredibly expensive to force the colonists to do stuff they don't want to do. The British government is strapped for cash, and so what? They're going to build a fence along the Proclamation Line and station it with soldiers because that's really the only way they're going to keep colonists out. And it's just not reasonable. And so with that, colonists continued to flood into the Ohio River Valley in violation of the Proclamation Line, which of course causes tension both between the British government and the colonists, who are now, again, just totally ignoring the British government, which on the one hand is somewhat par for the course as far as what we've seen in the first 150 years of relationship between the British and the colonists, but on the other hand is a pretty unpleasant precedent to set if the British are going to try to force the colonists to do anything going forward. And of course, we shouldn't ignore the fact that this is going to also create conflict with Native Americans who were told by the British government that they get to keep this land, and now colonists are still flooding onto it. So, solid solution, England. Proclamation Line. Of course, this led to multiple rebellions because obviously none of these issues were solved. First, you have the Paxton Boys Revolt. The Paxton Boys were a group of Scotch-Irish settlers in western Pennsylvania. They were previously had tensions with the government in Philadelphia, and they were having problems with Native Americans. So they went to the government to say, hey, could you help us out with these Native Americans? And the government said, aren't you on the wrong side of the Proclamation Line? Shouldn't you be moving back this way? And so the colonists, or the settlers, as they often do, take matters into their own hands and massacred a peaceful tribe of Native Americans who had nothing to do with the conflict. They were then declared outlaws, so they marched on Philadelphia after the Conestoga Indian Massacre. I should mention that the Conestoga were actually a native tribe who had attempted to assimilate into British society or into European society and had adopted European ways. And so it made it extra sort of embarrassing for the government that this group of natives who were trying to live in peace, specifically with settlers, were then massacred by a group of settlers. But the Paxton Boys then marched on Philadelphia, but fortunately, Benjamin Franklin was able to talk them down. So we didn't get a repeat of Bacon's Rebellion. Philadelphia was not burned to the ground, and they were able to negotiate a compromise by which the government would help subsidize the Paxton Boys killing Native Americans and would pay a bounty for every native scalp that they brought in. So, problem solved? Ooh, yeesh. Tensions, of course, continued to grow throughout the colonies because of this, and what you started to see is larger numbers of armed militia, especially on the frontiers, training and preparing to defend themselves ostensibly against Native Americans, but also potentially against the British government if they start putting more strict regulations on them. And so this period from 1763 onward is going to be a period of increasing, growing tensions and the militarization of colonial society, which, man, foreshadowing. We also see the height of the regulator movement during this time, where in the South, people were equally upset both about the lack of representation in their government and the proclamation line. And so the regulators, of course, were trying to increase the power of Western farmers. And so we saw there were regulators in most of the colonies, but large-scale outbreaks of violence happened in North Carolina. And although the governor eventually put the regulator movement down, it again somewhat foreshadows some of the tensions that we're going to see in the American Revolution. So, to what extent did the French and Indian War solve the problems that North Americans were facing? Not really at all. So all of these issues remain unresolved, and the British government is going to have to come up with a new solution to raise revenue and find a way to restore tensions, as basically at this point, everyone hates everyone else. So hopefully you can respond to these prompts with some depth. And when we come back tomorrow, we'll start looking at all of the famous set pieces moving closer and closer to the American Revolution.